and welcome to a brand new episode of Talking Law from Women in the Law UK. I'm Sally Penni MBE, a barrister at Kenworthy's Chambers in Manchester and the founder of Women in the Law UK. You can find out more about the work I do at womeninthelawuk.com, including regular webinars covering how to manage your well-being to how to advance in your career. There are so many different areas to explore, and all are available to watch again on YouTube and as podcasts. There's also a series of Talking Law books, which are limited edition, available on Amazon or Profits to Charity. The latest of the books is Talking Law 3, Celebrates Diversity in the Law. And you can also find books from me on employment law, data protection, and also on criminal law. Back to today. Today I'm interviewing Jason Pitter QC. Jason was called to the bar in 1994. He took silk in 2014 and is a member of New Park Court Chambers in Leeds, where he practices with a focus on serious and complex criminal litigation, professional misconduct and regulatory law. He's also a bencher at Gray's Inn and a Crown Court recorder. Jason told me how his decision to enter the law was born out of being a young black man growing up in a politically tense area of Leeds in the 1980s, and how a talk in a local community centre from a former guest on this podcast inspired him to enter the profession.
I'm not going to pretend I had a romantic view from when I was a little child. You know, I envisaged myself being in a wig and gown in the Crown Court. That didn't really happen for me. I think my interest in the law really was born out of being a child in the 80s and the 70s in an area in Leeds, Chapeltown, that was politically quite tense and hot at the time. And it was an environment where there was quite a bit of tension in the area. There was conflict, as I said, there were riots, and there were a number of people who felt a degree to which they felt aggrieved really about their interaction with the authorities. We also had, as a backdrop to that, quite high unemployment, and what goes with that was the deprivation that goes with that, and there were many people who felt they were suffering under the political systems at the time. So there was that level of unrest and that level of kind of disquiet really with how people in the community were being dealt with by the authorities. So the link then from that to the law really is this. Courtney Griffiths, who I think you put out, was it yesterday or the day before, his interview, which was superb.
His interview, yes.
Yeah. He was doing quite a bit of work around the country. He wasn't in silk at that time, but he used to represent people who were involved in the community. He was involved in quite a bit of the civil liberties work and criminal work in the community and represented people. I used to play basketball for a local team in Chapeltown, and he gave a talk at the community centre, the youth club, where I attended. And this was a talk very much about people knowing their rights, knowing where to go to for representation, and just assisting people understand where they were and where they fit within the structure and the establishment. And it was superb, and it was really inspirational for me at that time. And I was reaching that point in my life, so I was like mid-late teens, where I was thinking about where I wanted to go career-wise. And this is a part, you'll laugh at me now, that I had that choice then, where I was thinking about, well, would I be thinking about medicine? Would I be thinking about law? I wasn't really sure. I didn't come from a school where they were very good in terms of directing people in careers. I'll be frank with you, I just couldn't see myself being able to afford the time nor the finances to study for 8 years or so to become a doctor. But then meeting Courtney, it made the idea of being a lawyer a realistic one, and one where there'd be skills developed potentially where I could be really constructive in terms of the community and the issues that were affecting people. So that was the initial interest I had. Where do I go from there? Well, I went to King's College. I was fortunate to get in there. And then I started pupillage in Leeds. Now, we're going back 20, 24, 5, maybe 26 years. We could be here
You're
another.
much more experienced than me, so I'll focus your attention. You went to King's College, and I think that was a bit of a shocker because you've spoken at other panels on various other topics for women in the law and other organizations. But it was a shock because there you met people who were going off on open days in
Yeah.
suits and things,
Well,
didn't you?
Sally, that's exactly right. The thing for me is I had, on one level, been kind of shielded or cosseted within my community. It was an ethnically and not socially diverse, but ethnically diverse community, but predominantly in that, mainly Black, Caribbean, and people from the Asian community. That direct racism, perhaps you didn't experience on a day-to-day basis, surrounded by people who were just like you. And socially like me. When I look at the schools, everybody was like me in that sense. So socially from working class backgrounds, they were from, mixed racial backgrounds. But then I was removed from that environment, and I was, then in an environment at King's College, which is, one of the premier universities in the country. And I was very much on my own, not just by way of race in terms of the course, but also from social background. As I touched on, I didn't come from that school where they really were able to, by desire or otherwise, weren't able to equip somebody like me to start to thrive in the environment I was being moved to. I was very much like a fish out of water. Nowadays we speak about the imposter syndrome. It didn't really have that title back then, but I guess that was very much part of it. So there I was in this environment where I felt I didn't fit in. There were people who not only looked the part, they sounded the part. And all of this, added, I was still young, I was 18 at the time, to have that impact on me where I felt, maybe I'm not as good as the others here. And I got the grades, of course I was. But there was nothing around me and nobody around me who would help me engage with that process. The specific example you're referring to was, I think, only a few weeks into the course. And look, I'm not going to pretend I was the only one in this position. There were others, but it's that same sort of impact, where within a few weeks there were a number of people who were dressed in suits, some of them pinstripe, walking around with briefcases, all heading off straight from lectures to some place I didn't know. I thought I was missing out on some big party that I didn't have an invite to. And it turns out that what they all knew was that they had to, at some point, congregate at the careers fair at the Magic Circle firms of solicitors. I didn't have that background where I knew I had to ready myself for that. Now, of course, you could say, well, it was within me to find that information and get to know it. But you don't have that knowledge base. You don't have, whether it's parents, whether it's teachers, whether it's people within the profession who can help direct you in that way. So that was quite a difficult experience when I look back for me in terms of really embracing law and embracing the university life in the way that, when I tell people now, I think that's one of the things you need to do or be able to do is really engage with the course, engage with the career, engage with the other people who are on the courses and within your profession. But I felt very much on the outside. Some of that, looking back now, as I've gotten older, I can look back and say I could have changed things. But I always say this, I can't be too hard on myself. I was young, I was 18, and it's very much the case that the establishments, the universities, the institutions really should have been doing more for somebody like me to help to embrace the profession, embrace the course, embrace the study of law, and feel part of that family. Because as you'll remember, when you go to university, it isn't just learning the subject, it's learning potentially how to become part of the legal profession. you know, become part of that wider group and that wider family. And I felt not disabled, but I felt that that aspect was lacking. And you know, you see this time and again with people who don't fit the mold. And remember, King's College was very much back then that white middle class kind of environment so far as law was concerned. So for somebody like me, when you feel out of place, what do? You try to look for that which will make you comfortable. So for me, you're right. It was a difficult experience in that sense.
But that was a long time ago, wasn't it? If we fast forward a bit, because you've touched on there several things aside from imposter syndrome, diversity, and you're in Silk, you're highly successful, you sit on the Bar Council, and you've been involved in recruitment and to your circuit, which I often tease you about because the diversity on your circuit is not great. But I wondered whether they were some of the precursors to the things you're involved in, and what you think about diversity at the bar, given you're quite active, and one can put it in that way, in trying to improve things.
You're right. You're right to tease our circuit, although you do it from a position within a glass house, Sally. But you know, when I look at it, the reality is, when we come to the question of diversity, we're just not doing well enough. That is the reality. Some point to, well, when we look at the numbers, things are improving, and that one very superficial level is right. But we're talking about numbers improving over very slowly over a very long period of time. So we're talking a few percentage points since I started approaching 30 years ago. Now look, the real change recently hasn't been so much as diversity across the profession. I'm going to come back to what I considered in terms of diversity. Is in recent times there seems to be a willingness to have effective change and effective diversity. Maybe that's only more recently because of things like the Black Lives Matter movement and those considerations. But even on my own circuit, I see a willingness, and we have a program now where we're really driving to improve diversity. The leader of circuit's very engaged with that. We have a separate committee really focusing on diversity so far as gender, so far as race, and as, of course, so far as social background. But when we look at diversity and where we are now, and whether it's effective diversity, well, you only need to look not just at raw numbers coming in, but you need to look at where people from the non-traditional backgrounds are within the profession. Yes. There's a significant overrepresentation. We can turn this into a data interview. I don't think you want me to do that, but you only need to look at the overrepresentation in certain areas of work, the publicly funded spheres, in terms of ethnic minority barristers, in terms of women at the bar. Even in crime, there's then further direction in terms of ethnic minorities and women in terms of, say, sexual offences or the less well remunerated work. The high profile stuff does not always have a proper diverse reflection, doesn't have a properly diverse collection of counsel engaged in those types of work. So there is improved diversity, but we're still in a really bad place so far as I'm concerned, in terms of the progression through the profession of people from ethnic minority backgrounds, for women, including the concepts of retention, when you look at sexual orientation also. So there's been progress, but nowhere near enough. I look at my circuit, there is that recognition that more needs to be done. There's about 1,000 barristers, and maybe only, I'm going to be specific here, just because this is where it's most acute. With 1,000 barristers, there's maybe only, I think, there's only 4 black barristers. Now there's more Asian barristers.
4?
But
Wow, that's more than I thought. I thought you only had 2.
well, yeah, I told you were throwing stones from a glass house. But
I know.
You're throwing them at another glass house, though, Sally. So no, we laugh about it because we can, and if we don't, we go mad. But it just highlights the amount of work that needs to be done. There is the willingness for change, and whilst it's there, we really have to take it and drag it along before that enthusiasm disappears.
Absolutely.
But look, Sally, I look at the changes. And whilst there's been the changes in numbers, I remember when I started, I was the only black pupil for a long time. And you can imagine, although you started quite a few years after me, the attitude towards somebody who wasn't just black, but was also from, what people would view as a socially deprived background. So I was from one of the areas that a lot of the barristers, the only interaction they'd have with people would be to represent them. So you can imagine it was not a straightforward exercise. And with somebody like me would come the preconceptions about somebody like me, the stereotypes, the view that, well, this person will be all right, but won't be as good as some of the others here. And you're coming into this already with, the imposter syndrome, the idea you're not as good. You only need to be told that a few times before it can really start to knock you back. Yes. And I'll be entirely frank, I experienced those things. The direct, the indirect racism, the indirect comments about ability, the idea that I was too much like the stereotype, the idea I was too much like those people who they represent. But you know what? That was inevitable because some of those things were exactly what I was about. That's the community I came from, and I wasn't really going to change myself in that regard. No. What I hope has happened is over time, people's perceptions of somebody like me and somebody like me having the ability to succeed, hopefully that has changed rather than me having to change too much. We do all change because we develop and mature. But what really had to change was the perception that somebody with my background could not succeed. Hopefully that has changed.
I think it has to an extent. But can I ask you, Jason, about your work and the type of work? And I always love asking this question. What's been the most memorable case that you've been in? And I know that you've been involved in some very high-profile cases.
Sally, the case that stays with me the most isn't the most high-profile, isn't the most serious. I doubt it would have been reported anywhere, to be frank with you. Many years ago now, I represented a young guy who was from the community I grew up in Chapeltown, and he was charged with a firearms offence, I think it was, but was getting involved just at that very beginning stage in taking the wrong path in life. I mean, he'd already taken it because he was in court. And I remember at the end of it, we got a decent result, a good result at the end, and he wasn't convicted of the most serious allegations he faced. And look, you're going to tell me off because it's not for me to start giving people guidance in life. But I had a long chat with him really at the end of the case about where his life was heading. And this was a young man who was really talented. He had been to college, he'd studied art, and he had some designs on being a graphic designer. Some of his work was superb. But he was at that kind of fork in the road where, go left, go right. And he was very much heading left. And I remember speaking to him, and I'll be frank, this is where I let myself down. I was not confident he was really absorbing anything I was telling him. Yes. And then I came across him again only a few years later, and it was by complete surprise. It was out of context in that he was involved in doing some work near my house. And I remember looking at him and thinking, I know this man from somewhere. And he may have thought I was being kind of snooty and ignoring me. I wasn't. Just when you see somebody out of context, you don't immediately make the
No.
connection. And he reminded me who it was, and I couldn't believe it. I was so happy because what he was doing was quite inspirational in a sense, because he was teaching and helping other people. So he was helping a group of children with some graffiti type work, but it's graphic design type work. And he made it clear to me that I'm not saying I made the change, but that moment where he hadn't got off with it, but he'd been given another chance, made a big difference to him. And he didn't go left in the end. He actually did go right. So that's the case that probably I would say stays with the most, because it's one of the starkest examples of the way we might be able to make a difference in people's lives. You see, quite often, we get stuck in that kind of humdrum, and we don't really think enough that what we're doing is quite important to the people we're representing, and that's the sort of thing that makes me realize sometimes when you take a step back, you can make a difference to people's lives.
Yeah.
You told me to. I'm gonna sneak in a third one. The very short one is this in terms of the impact. I was recently involved in one of the inquests in relation to smart motorways, and I represented the family in respect of one of them, and the outcome was one where the coroner made certain observations to the Home Secretary. Now, the reason I mention that is because when you're involved with the families in those circumstances, you start to see again how much the outcome of the case means to the people involved. In one of those cases, the mother of the deceased child was there throughout. A lorry driver had driven into her grandfather's vehicle, which had stopped for reasons which are not explicable and perhaps worthy of criticism on one level. But the mother was so gracious and so forgiving of the truck driver, her own father, and her whole focus was, I just don't want anybody else to be involved in this sort of situation again. Now, I'm not speaking to you to criticize smart motorways. That's all being looked at. That's a separate issue. But you see that sort of human characteristics, those good qualities in people, that sense of forgiveness. You see there that she was so interested in the outcome of the case and how it could affect other people. Again, another example of how it can, and how what we do can impact the lives of others. So I sneak that one in. The third one is this: the career question was the first, or one of the last cases before I took Silk, and it was a case where I was involved in the prosecution of those people who helped. Do you remember going back about 10 years ago, Raoul Mott?
Oh, yes, he'd killed a police officer or injured
a police officer. Right? He killed another person, and he'd been effectively on the run, become a fugitive in the northeast. Why that was important to me, because of the scale of the case, the profile of it, but also what it involved in terms of preparing it, and from an educational perspective, I was led in that case by one of the people who's been hugely important in my career, Robert Smith, who's well regarded nationally, but somebody who taught me a lot of what I now put into effect. And that was the case which technically helped me make that step from being a junior to becoming a Silk, or being ready for Silk. And it brought home to me the amount of organization, preparation, the management, the sacrifice you have to make to make sure things are done properly, to make sure when you are, at the center of the focus, you make sure you, to use a phrase, represent.
Absolutely. Well, on that note then, Jason, you mentioned Courtney Griffiths was an inspiration to you. You will be an inspiration to others coming behind us. And so role modeling is important. But I'm very concerned about COVID and the effect on COVID, not just on diversity, but on young people, on women, the retention issue we've touched on. So I wonder if you can give maybe 3 tips of advice to people entering or aspiring or junior lawyers, barristers and solicitors presently about resilience and really carrying on, because, the times are not great looking forwards. And it can be difficult for those starting out.
I think the first one, because this would be the one I would, if I was to go back, see me as a young person starting out in this job, the first one would be to be prepared to back yourself. All right. You have to be able to recognize your talents and have the confidence to back those talents, to have the confidence to look around you and say, well, look, I can be as good as any of these people around me. I'm here on merit, and therefore I have to back myself. That's the first one. And as I say, I'm focusing this very much on people coming to the profession, because I recognize that there is a responsibility on the teaching institutions and also the profession itself to help people coming into the profession, particularly people who are from a non-traditional background like myself, to develop in these areas. So it's all very well as saying be confident. I tell you now, when you're somebody lacking confidence, somebody just saying be confident isn't going to help you. But if you can be prepared to back yourself. All right. The second thing is this. You also have to be prepared to embrace the profession. Now, that has to be distinguished from changing yourself massively to become part of the establishment. That's a separate issue. When I say embrace the profession, I mean you have to be prepared to become an important cog within it. You have to be prepared to work within it, if not just to make changes, but to progress through it. Find out as much as you can about it. Be part of the organizations, because that's how you then make contacts. That's how you then have those links who may be able to point you in the right direction. That's how you will start to learn almost by osmosis from the people who are already within the profession. For a while, and I always use myself as an example for where I went wrong and some of the changes I would make. For a while, I kept myself, partly because I did not feel part of it. I was a little bit distant from the profession, distant from those who were at university studying law. But as a result of that, or partly as a result of that, I didn't pick up or get as much from it as I could at all times. Now, it's a two-way street, of course. I think there's a greater responsibility, as I said, on the institutions and the professions to reach out and draw people in. But it's not always happening, and it's not happening at the pace we want. So if I was advising people, I would say try to, if you can, to make yourself part of it. Try and embrace it. Find out as much as you can and be a part of it. That doesn't mean you have to change who you are as a person, but you need to have you as a person being part of the profession. The third thing is this, and Sally, I know from everything you've done and us trying to arrange a time to get together, the third is this. You really have to be prepared to make sacrifices. Work on the basis that almost everybody who is in this profession, almost, not everybody, who succeeds is somebody who is prepared to work about as hard as they possibly can. And there's somebody who, to do that, is making sacrifices. If you want to look at it on a purely competitive level, some people do, and you want to get ahead of others, or you want to succeed, not everybody will succeed, but if you want to be the one who succeeds, progresses through, becomes, say, a SILT, becomes a judge, that means you're rising to the top. The only way you're going to do that, all things being equal, is if you are prepared to work harder than others, or at least as hard as the very best. Now, the reality is you can't do that without making some sacrifices. Now, of course, there has to be some allowance made for people's circumstances, but change is very slow, slower than we'd all like. And where you can make the changes, you should. And where you can reasonably make the sacrifices without damaging yourself, those around you, you should. But recognize it's a tough journey. You have to work hard and you have to be prepared to make sacrifices if you want to succeed. The question that you raised, which is a separate one from those three tips, so far as things like retention and the progress of women and people from diverse backgrounds, well, that's a separate one. I'm not sure we could squeeze that into this
No.
interview. I think there is a lot that the profession has to do to make sure we deal with the reasons for the lack of retention, the lack of diversity throughout the profession. There's a lot we have to do. But what I would say to people coming into it is recognize that there is that disparity, because one of the things which can hit people hard is when they see it for the first time.
Yes.
And that first time you see it can be hugely dispiriting. For some, it's an encouragement, but not for most. For most, it is hugely dispiriting. So we have to be ready in the sense of understanding there is that disparity, and be ready if we can to stand up to it. And where we see it, we deal with it. There is also this. I do think there is a responsibility on those of us who have an understanding of the reasons behind the lack of diversity, those who are from a diverse background, those from, say, the protected, as the phrase is, the protected characteristic groups.
Yeah.
I really do think we have a responsibility to give assistance to those who have a similar sort of background, or who may have been through similar experiences. And the reason I say that is it's one of the things when I started. Of course, in the very early days, I had Courtney as an inspiration, and to a degree, he's always been a mentor. But that's one face, and we geographically were in different places. But what we all need is somebody around us who is prepared to help us or guide us. And therefore, I do think there is that responsibility. If there was another tip, if you allowed me for, I would say the fourth one is be prepared to help others in your position, because
Yes.
that's in the end what made a big difference to me. Because I was in the end fortunate in a sense that I did have people who became allies, not necessarily just from within our community or with my background, who became good allies and through the years have helped me and remain my good and close friends. But, I do think people in my position, Sally, people in your position, have a responsibility to equally hold out that hand to help people up.
Yes. Well, it's a good point, but it's quite a pressure, isn't it? Because it would be quite easy to progress in the profession, take silk as you have, not be on any committees, not be, having a podcast showing the diversity in the profession, not be speaking in schools, not be doing a whole raft of things, which there are some who don't do it. And so it is a pressure. To an extent, it's a good point, isn't it? Because we're doing it. But to a large extent, maybe we need the majority to also embrace that. And some are. It can feel like a pressure.
Well, Sally, it feels like a pressure because it is. Because it's something that you end up doing on top of the work you're doing from, I was going to say 9 to 5. That doesn't exist, but you know what I mean. On top of the day, evening, night job as our jobs turn out to be. All right. And you are right. People who are not interested in diversity may not have that additional pressure. So is it fair when the competition only need to focus on their own work for us to take on this responsibility? Well, I tell you now, I don't think the responsibility should just fall to us. And in fact, in so many ways, the greater responsibility shouldn't be on us. The greater responsibility should be on the wider profession or the traditional backgrounds practitioners to make the changes. That is right. But I'm not really one for standing around just waiting for things to happen. Because by the time that happens, it could be too late. So I'm prepared to take on that extra pressure. I know you are, I know others are. And I view myself as having a responsibility to do that. But I think the responsibility spreads across the whole profession. And I do see some of that now in terms of the enthusiasm. So as I said, on circuit, we're trying to engage with the schools as a circuit. Now, this is something I've done in the past very much by myself. I took the view, look, I'm not waiting for everybody to be interested in this. I know where I can make a difference. But now the wider profession's engaged. That's great. But you are right. It is a pressure. I'm prepared to take it on, but I'm very slow to criticize those who feel they cannot take on the responsibility. I'm a little bit disappointed. But when I see somebody from our background and they're not prepared to reach out that hand, I do feel disappointed. But I do understand that it is quite a significant pressure.
Yes, and maybe it's not for everybody. Well, let's talk about what we can do to relieve the pressure of court and our work. Actually, because our job, we're self-employed, we do, big cases, complicated cases. You have to have a love of the law, which I'm always a legal geek. But the burnout rate is high, people tired, people maybe drinking too much, not exercising enough. And so I'm very keen on finding ways that we can all improve our well-being in the profession. So I want to ask you about what you do for well-being. Then I want to move on and ask you about books or your favorite book and a fictional lawyer, and finish really by asking you where and what next. Really. So there are 4 questions I'll break down in turn. The first thing is, what do you do for your well-being?
That's if I have it. No, Sally, this has changed over time. Do you remember I said earlier on that
you play basketball?
I played basketball, and when I joined the profession, I did view myself as being very much on the outside, and that pressure of not fitting in. I know there are many people who are from similar backgrounds have felt the same thing, and you become more and more pressured, or you feel more pressured by the fact you're not fitting in. You feel more pressured by, that lack of confidence, whether you're succeeding. The imposter syndrome, sorry to reuse the phrase, can be quite overwhelming. And yes. For me, when I look back, and this is purely by chance, by the fact that I was from Leeds and I remained in Leeds, my outlet then was the fact I had that support network from playing basketball. And for years, I carried on playing in the same team I did from when I was a teenager. I carried on playing, probably for too long, certainly physically. But that gave me a separate support network completely away from the profession. All right. So I still had that same social group around me, which was able to, in a sense, it gives you that confidence. You feed off that because, you find your kind of self-worth. So that's fortunate. I had that. But the point that it taught me was this. I think all of us need something completely away from the job at some point, completely away. It may be some activity you're not even any good at, but it takes you out of the bubble we live in. We, as a legal profession, we're quite a small community, but we have this sense of self-importance, and we forget where we can actually fit within the wider kind of society. All right. Basketball helped me do that because I was just one of the other players, wasn't the best player. I was a captain, but I wasn't the best player by any stretch. So, I knew my self-worth, and you had people who would there respect you and you'd respect them. All right. So that was restorative for me. As I've gone on, I've seen the importance of maintaining your physical fitness and your physical health as far as possible. So When I'm not working, I do like to get some exercise where I can. I cook an awful lot now. That's a sign probably of me getting older. Um, but I love to cook. I love barbecuing, and this stems back to the Jamaican roots now. I love trying to, make jerk chicken and the like. So I love those old traditional styles of cooking that I bring in now. All right, very interested in that. And I've kept throughout my love of music. So I grew up where I was very heavily interested in uh, hip hop music, what I would call the golden era. So back into the 90s and the late 80s. Also reggae music, and also now as I develop through jazz and jazz funk. So those things are all still important to me. And I always switch off at some point listening to music. So you have those things, you have that base of a life away from the job, whether
Yes.
that's through sport. For me, it's my friends, family, sport. Um, Another activity like cooking, I can switch off altogether, and music. Those are the three kind of things which have helped maintain my well-being, and I maintain them.
Yes. Are you much of a reader? And if you are, what's your favorite book? And who's your favorite fictional lawyer? I don't know if you watch anything legal. Perhaps you can share with me.
Just to carry on the topical theme of law, we're both lawyers, so I'll begin with that. It's going to sound a bit corny, but I always had a thing for To Kill a Mockingbird and Atticus Finch, but my
It's
views
not.
changed over time, and I can see why why I was attracted to him, because when you think about, and I didn't get this fully at school, I'll hold my hand up to that, but as I went back and read it recently, there's aspects of that which are so important to now and what we're trying to promote now. The issues of
Yeah.
race, the perception of, somebody who is, from a minority group. And there was an important aspect of it which, stood out to me. And it's that feature which I'm going to misquote it, but, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. And isn't that, I think it goes on from there until you climb inside his skin and walk around
Thin
him.
Walsh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and isn't that so much what we say now when when people say, well, what's it like, or what is it that you as minority lawyers or members of the minority community in this country, what is it you're complaining about, or you've got it relatively easy, and the retort to that is a proper one, which is, until you walk a mile in my shoes, you won't understand what it is I'm going through, and there's so much in that, because it's only when you start to not look at the consequence, but look at what people have been through and the journey they have taken. And this is something that feeds into a lot of the aspects of what we do and what I do, say, even with recruitment. I don't just look at the CVs of the people that are coming. I look at the journey they've taken to get there. And then you
Absolutely.
start to have
Yeah.
an understanding. I approach it that way with my clients, often with my opponents. You just look at the journey they've taken, and you start to have a different appreciation of how they respond and how they act. So that, and I'll be frank, it's developed over time in terms of the significance of it. So that's my fictional lawyer. In terms of books, this changes over time, but I've recently been reading, for reasons I won't bore you with because the reasons are not interesting. But I'm a huge fan of an author who's I think he's a psychologist, but he's of Jamaican descent or part Jamaican descent, called Malcolm Gladwell, who's written a number
Yes.
of pop psychological books, but he wrote one which was put out as like a route to success, but it's much more than that. It's a proper sociological study called The Outliers. And it helped analyze how it is different people rise to the top or become successful. He looked at things such as socioeconomic factors, looked at things such as just pure good fortune and how all of these things feed into it, cultural differences. And it was really instructive to me in terms of how different people make it to the top. So when we look at good fortune, we just look at things like the toss of a coin. Did you catch the right bus? But it can stem back to things such as, are you lucky enough to have come from a privileged background? And you start to see that, how people who are successful invariably will have put in a lot of work on top of that. But it was looking at all these different things which come together, including racial background, cultural background, which may contribute to success. And it's helped me understand my position. It's helped me understand the people coming through and coming to the profession. And it's also instructed me in terms of how I can help people coming through, because one of the things it focused on was this idea of confidence, and how it is that people from different backgrounds will have different levels of confidence, and how that can impact on somebody from a very early stage. And if it's not nurtured, dealt with, or they're not helped to be more confident, once they're set back, they're set back. So it's looking at all of these factors in terms of people becoming successful. So I've returned to that recently. I always go back to it just to put things into perspective. So right now, that's my favorite book.
Wonderful. My next question is about what's next. Lord Reed, the current president of the Supreme Court in the UK, succeeding Lady Hale, another good Yorkshire lawyer. Lord Reed said last year he's got 6 years before he retires, and he would like to see the Supreme Court more diverse. And so I suppose I'm asking you by way of a challenge. What's next for you? Where might you go? And then I just want to finish by asking you what advice you would have to your 21-year-old self, the Jason Pitter, who wasn't in silk, who wasn't a recorder, who wasn't recruiting, who wasn't doing all these other things on top of the job. What advice you'd give that Jason?
And listen, knowing you're going to say this is a cop-out, but Sally, at the moment, I don't have fixed views about where I want to end up. All right, I really am enjoying what I'm doing. I'm not I don't view myself as having been very long in silk. You're going to push me, I know you are, to say whether I have any judicial aspirations. I think when I started, certainly I did, and they'll be there somewhere. They just haven't crystallized yet. But I will say this, and it fits in with the wider point you were making in terms of diversity. I do think there is a responsibility for people in my or our position to start to look towards careers on the bench, to start to make that difference, to start to look not just towards the circuit bench, but they have to look higher as well. That's not to put the pressure on them. For some people, it's not for them. I'm not saying I'm necessarily the one with the ability, or I should be the person. But I do think as we have more people in our positions, so in silk, more of us have to have on our agenda that we want to go further, because we can't just look towards the lack of diversity and not view ourselves of having some responsibility in terms of being role models or setting a standard for others. Don't view that as me saying there's an obligation on anybody to do it. I wouldn't criticize anybody, because let's face the reality, it isn't for everybody. So some people are quite content doing what they're doing. But I think those who can and are interested in it, I do think there is that responsibility then to really go for it, even if it is to say, look, this is the level you can achieve, because rightly or wrongly, people view the judicial kind of profession as being the pinnacle of being in the law. Some people, in fact, view it as just being in silk and are happy doing that. So I think those who have an interest and have the ability, we have that responsibility to go for it where we can.
And what about my final question, really, not penultimate, about where...
The younger me.
The younger you, not just you per se, but what would you say to that, Jason? I know we've been on a panel previously when we were talking about don't limit yourself, whether it's the areas you practice or whatever. And it might be that you say diversify yourself. I don't know. But what would you say to that, Jason?
When I was in my early 20s was probably where I was at my most vulnerable in terms of confidence, esteem, self-esteem. And what I would say to me is what ultimately my pupil supervisor, my pupil master said to me, and things hadn't been going well initially at one point. And I said to him, "How am I getting on?" And he said 4 words to me. He said, "You are doing just fine." 5 words, sorry. "You are doing just fine." And it may sound lukewarm, but it was important in this sense because it wasn't really an assessment of how brilliantly I was doing. I didn't want to hear that, actually. I just wanted to know I was doing as well as everybody else. And that's what he was trying to get across. And that phrase, those 5 words made the biggest difference to me at that point. You are doing just fine. In other words, you're just as good as anybody else. So that's what I'd say to the younger me. You're doing just fine. What would I say in terms of people going forwards? Sally, it is about not limiting yourself because people do tend to do that. In fact, they're put on us actually. People feel that they have to be either pigeonholed because the opportunities out there, because people tell them this is the level you are operating at. But there's a problem with that. If you limit yourself, you don't develop all the skills you can. So where you have opportunities to progress, to try something else, I would encourage myself to do it. Sometimes it's just that we're worried about failing, and I would say as part of that, don't worry about failing. Worry about not trying. Remember I said to you, I'm a big fan of what I call golden era hip hop, and one of the things although it's not from that time, was one of the lines from it's a Jay-Z song. I can't remember which one, but it's in effect. I'm not going to try and rap it, but the effect of it is this: there are two birds talking to each other, and there's a metaphor in here which I'll explain. So one says to the other, "How did you get to be so fly?" Fly as in being cool. And the big one says to the little one, "I got to be so fly by not being afraid of falling out of the sky." And that is quite significant in the sense of, you progress, you get better by not worrying about failure. And that's what confidence is all about, really, in a sense. This is a recurrent theme with me. I know, and I'm sorry about that, Sally. Confidence really is linked to that fear of failure. And if you look at some of the men and women who do the best, it's not so much that they have a fear of failure, but they just have a real drive to do well quite often. Of course, you want to not fail, but that shouldn't become prohibitive. And my experience, it's only anecdotal, my experience is that those who do the best, they don't want to lose, they don't want to fail. But more than that, they just want to succeed. And the only way you do that is by taking it on. And you'll have seen people who will take on any case. They'll apply for anything because they don't worry about the rejection. That confidence comes with many years, quite often, of teaching. People say, keep going for it, keep pushing. You are good enough. And you develop a really thick skin, a thick hide. But as I said, the biggest failure is not trying. The biggest failure is not putting yourself in the mix. Rather put yourself in the mix and be rejected than not even be considered for it. So it's those two things. Don't be afraid of flying high. Just recognize you're doing all right.
Well, I think that is a perfect place to end. I feel like you were talking to me then. Just keep just keep going for it. Yeah, thank you. I seem to have acquired a brother or a father, literally. But Jason Pitter, it's been wonderful talking law with you. Thank you for being a fantastic guest.
It's been great
this afternoon.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you, Jason.
I've loved it, Sally.
Big thank you to Jason Pitter for talking law with me, Sally Penni MBE. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please do share Talking Law with your friends or colleagues. You can also enjoy my other series, the Law and Guidance podcast, all about the law and all about understanding the law. You can find me on Twitter at SallyPenny1 or search for Sally Penni or Women in the Law UK on LinkedIn or Instagram. And finally, don't forget the extensive resources for anyone working within the law available at womeninthelawuk.com. Thanks to our production team, Sam Walker and Michael Blades at What Goes On Media.